I was holding a letter in my trembling hands at 2 a.m., just 8 hours before we'd lower his casket into the ground. What I read in those faded pages didn't just change everything I thought I knew about my father. It revealed a truth so profound that it would reshape how the entire family remembered him forever. The house was silent, except for the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking each second that brought us closer to saying goodbye. I'd come downstairs because sleep was impossible. How do you sleep when tomorrow you're burying the man who raised you, the man who frustrated you, the man who seemed to always fall short of who you needed him to be? I wasn't looking for answers. I was just trying to find some peace in the quiet darkness of his study, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of his cologne that still lingered on his reading chair. But there, tucked between the pages of his old Bible, the one he carried through Vietnam, was an envelope with my name on it, written in his careful handwriting. Before I share this life-altering discovery with you, I need to know something. Comment below and tell me, have you ever discovered something about someone you loved that completely changed how you saw them? Don't worry about being perfect with your words. Sometimes the most powerful truths come from the heart, not the head. That letter would teach me something that I wish I had understood while he was still alive. Something that would transform not just how I remembered him, but how I see every complicated relationship in my life. Something that would show me the difference between the stories we tell ourselves about people and the truth they carry in their hearts. You see, my father was not an easy man to love. At least, that's what I had convinced myself over the years. He was distant when I needed him close. He was critical when I needed encouragement. He seemed to save his patience for everyone except his own family. He was the kind of man who would help a neighbor fix their roof on a Saturday but couldn't find time to attend my soccer games. Growing up, I built a narrative around who he was, the workaholic who cared more about his business than his children, the man who showed love through providing but never through presence, the father who taught me responsibility but forgot to teach me that I was worthy of affection just for existing. Maybe you know this feeling. Maybe you've had someone in your life, a parent, a spouse, a sibling, who left you feeling like you were never quite enough. Someone whose love felt conditional, whose approval seemed always just out of reach. Someone who made you question your own worth because their actions never seemed to match the love you desperately needed from them. The pain of these relationships runs deep because they matter so much. We can forgive strangers easily, but the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally, when they fail us, when they seem to choose everything else over us, when they leave us feeling invisible in our own families, that creates wounds that we carry for decades. I carried those wounds. Every achievement in my adult life was partly an attempt to finally be worthy of the attention he never seemed to give. Every relationship I entered, I brought the fear that I wasn't enough, that I would be abandoned or overlooked, just like I felt I had been by him. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw his disappointment reflected back at me. The night before his funeral, I was drowning in regret. All the conversations we never had, all the times I chose anger over understanding, all the years I spent building walls instead of bridges. I was mourning not just his death, but the relationship we never got to have, the father-son connection that felt like it died long before he did. But grief has a way of opening us up to truths we couldn't see before. When someone dies, especially someone whose love we questioned, we're forced to confront the complexity of human relationships. We're faced with the reality that people are never just one thing, that the stories we tell ourselves about others are often incomplete, filtered through our own pain and expectations. That night, sitting in his chair, holding that letter, I was about to learn that everything I thought I knew about my father was just the surface of a much deeper story. A story that would teach me that sometimes the people we think love us least are actually loving us in ways we never recognized. Sometimes the people who seem most distant are carrying burdens we never imagined. Sometimes the love we needed was always there, hidden behind walls we were too hurt to see around. What I discovered in that letter wasn't just about him. It was about all of us, about how we see each other through the lens of our own needs and disappointments, about how we create narratives that protect our hearts, but also blind us to the full truth of another person's humanity. If you've ever felt unloved, unseen, or unworthy because of how someone treated you, this story is for you. If you've ever carried resentment towards someone who hurt you, if you've ever wished you could understand why people act the way they do, if you've ever wondered if it's possible to heal relationships that seem broken beyond repair, what happened in those pages that night might change everything for you too. Because sometimes the most transformative discoveries happen when we're brave enough to look beyond what we thought we knew. Sometimes the key to healing our deepest wounds isn't changing other people. It's understanding them in a way that changes us. My father, Thomas Mitchell, was a man everyone in our small town respected, but few truly knew. To the outside world, he was the successful businessman who built Mitchell Construction from nothing into the largest contracting company in 3 counties. He was the man who employed half the town during the recession of '08, who never missed a church service, who coached Little League for kids whose fathers had abandoned them. But inside our house, he was different, or at least that's how it felt to me growing up. He was the man who left for work before sunrise and came home after dark, his hands still dirty from whatever job site he'd visited that day. He was the man who sat at the dinner table in silence, methodically eating whatever my mother had prepared, his mind clearly somewhere else. He was the man who responded to my excited stories about school with distracted nods and "That's nice, son," without ever really looking up from his plate. When I brought home report cards with straight A's, he would glance at them and say, "Good, keep it up." When I scored the winning touchdown in the homecoming game, he wasn't there to see it because he was working late again. When I needed help with homework, he would tell me to figure it out myself because that's how you learn to be independent. I remember being 10 years old, desperately wanting him to throw a baseball with me in the backyard. I would wait on the front porch after school, watching for his truck to pull into the driveway, planning exactly what I would say to convince him to spend just 15 minutes with me. But by the time he got home, I was already in bed, and the next morning, he was gone before I woke up. My mother would make excuses for him. "Your father works hard to provide for us," she would say. "He shows love by making sure we have everything we need." But I didn't need everything we had. I needed him. I needed to feel like I mattered more than his next construction project. I needed to feel like his son was worth 15 minutes of his precious time. The pattern continued through my teenage years. When I got my driver's license, he handed me the keys to his old pickup truck with a grunt and walked away. No congratulations, no father-son moment about responsibility or freedom. When I was accepted to college, he wrote the tuition check without ceremony and said, "Don't waste it." I learned to stop expecting more from him. I learned to find validation elsewhere, from teachers, from coaches, from friends' parents who showed up to games and asked about my day with genuine interest. I learned to build a life that didn't depend on his approval or attention because those things felt impossible to earn. By the time I was an adult, our relationship had settled into a polite but distant routine. Holiday gatherings where we made small talk about the weather and business. Birthday calls that lasted exactly 3 minutes. Christmas gifts exchanged with the efficiency of a business transaction. I told myself I had made peace with who he was. I convinced myself that some fathers just aren't emotionally available, that some men of his generation simply didn't know how to express love beyond paying bills and keeping the lights on. I rationalized his distance as his way of making me strong, independent, self-reliant, But underneath all that rationalization was a hurt that never healed. A little boy who never stopped wondering why his father seemed to care more about everyone else's children than his own. Why he would spend Saturday mornings helping neighbors with their home repairs, but couldn't find time to fix the bike that sat broken in our garage for months. There were moments, rare glimpses, when I thought I saw something different in him. Times when I would catch him watching me from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. Times when his hand would hover over my shoulder as if he wanted to reach out but couldn't quite make the connection. Times when he seemed on the verge of saying something important but would clear his throat and talk about the weather instead. I dismissed these moments. I told myself I was seeing what I wanted to see, projecting my own needs onto a man who had already shown me exactly who he was, through years of consistent distance. The night before his funeral, I was drowning in the weight of our unfinished story. All the things left unsaid, all the connection that felt impossible, all the ways I had failed to understand him, and he had failed to reach me. That's when I found the letter tucked inside his Bible, the leather-bound book that had been his companion through Vietnam, through building his business, through raising a family he seemed to love from a distance. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, written in the careful script he used for important documents. But as I began to read, I realized this wasn't a document at all. This was his heart, poured out in words he could never say out loud. "To my son," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably wondering why I never told you these things while I was alive. The truth is, I tried 1,000 times, but the words never came out right. So I wrote them down instead, hoping that someday you'd understand." What followed was a confession that turned everything I thought I knew about my father upside down. He wrote about Vietnam, about things he had never spoken of to anyone, about watching his best friend die in his arms, about the promise he made to that dying friend to take care of his widow and children back home, about how that promise became a lifelong commitment that shaped every decision he made afterward. The woman I knew as Mrs. Henderson from church was actually the widow of his fallen friend. The children I thought he was just helping out were the children he had promised to raise as his own. Every Saturday morning he spent fixing their house, every little league game he coached for her son, every time he seemed to care more about other people's families than his own. It was all part of a sacred promise made in a jungle halfway around the world. But there was more. He wrote about how loving those children the way he had promised to love them made him terrified of loving me. How he was afraid that if he got too close to me, if he allowed himself to love me the way his heart wanted to, he might not be strong enough to keep his promise to his friend. How he convinced himself that providing for me, keeping me safe, making me strong and independent was the purest form of love he could offer, without compromising his duty to the dead. He wrote about watching me play baseball from the parking lot because he couldn't bear to sit in the stands and not cheer the loudest, about driving by the school just to catch a glimpse of me during recess, about keeping every report card, every school paper, every photo in a box under his bed because he was so proud of me he couldn't find words big enough to express it. The letter revealed a man I had never known, a man torn between duty and desire, between a promise to the dead and love for the living. A man who thought that loving me less would somehow honor his fallen friend more. A man who sacrificed his own happiness and ours because he believed it was the right thing to do. As I sat there in the darkness, reading word after word of his careful handwriting, I felt my entire understanding of our relationship crumbling and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Every memory I had categorized as evidence of his indifference was suddenly reframed through this new lens of understanding. The distance I had interpreted as rejection was actually his misguided attempt at honor. The love I thought was missing had been there all along, just hidden behind a wall of duty and sacrifice that he thought was noble. This wasn't just about my father anymore. This was about something much deeper, something that the great psychologist Carl Jung spent his life trying to help people understand. It was about the masks we wear, the shadows we hide, and the complex motivations that drive human behavior in ways that others can rarely see or understand. Jung called it the persona, the face we present to the world, the role we think we need to play to be acceptable, honorable, or worthy. My father had been living behind a persona for decades, playing the role of the dutiful friend who kept his promise above all else, even at the cost of his relationship with his own son. But beneath that persona was his true self, the man who loved me desperately, but had convinced himself that expressing that love would somehow betray his fallen friend. Reading his letter, I began to understand what Jung meant when he wrote about the shadow. Those parts of ourselves that we reject, deny, or hide because we believe they make us weak or bad or unworthy. My father's shadow contained his deepest longing to be a present, affectionate father to me. He had pushed that desire into the darkness because he thought it conflicted with his higher duty. But shadows don't disappear when we ignore them. They find other ways to express themselves. All those times I caught him watching me from across the room, that was his shadow leaking through. All those moments when his hand hovered over my shoulder, that was his true self trying to break through the prison of his persona. All those gifts that seemed impersonal but were exactly what I needed. That was his love, finding the only expression he allowed it to have. The tragedy wasn't that he didn't love me. The tragedy was that he had created a story in his mind where loving me fully would make him a bad person, a betrayer of his friend's trust. He had split himself in two, and both parts of him suffered because of it. I suffered too, because I was trying to get love from his persona when his authentic love was locked away in his shadow. This is what so many of us do in our relationships, isn't it? We create stories about why people act the way they do, and those stories are almost always incomplete. We see the persona, the mask, the role someone thinks they need to play, and we mistake that for the whole person. We respond to their behavior without understanding the complex inner world that created that behavior. My father wasn't an emotionally unavailable man. He was an emotionally torn man, trying to honor competing loyalties that he didn't know how to reconcile. He wasn't indifferent to me. He was terrified that if he let himself love me the way he wanted to, he would somehow be betraying the memory of his friend and failing in his duty to that friend's family. Jung understood that every person contains multitudes. We all have parts of ourselves that conflict with other parts. We all have desires that seem to contradict our duties. We all have emotions that we're afraid to feel because they might make us appear weak or selfish or wrong. The key to understanding others and ourselves is learning to see beyond the surface behavior to the complex inner drama that's always playing out beneath. As I continued reading, I discovered that my father had spent decades in therapy, trying to find a way to be both a faithful friend and a loving father. He wrote about sessions where he wept for the son he felt he couldn't fully claim because of his promise to the dead. He wrote about the counselor who had helped him see that his friend would never have wanted him to sacrifice his relationship with his own child. But by then the pattern was so established that he didn't know how to break it. He had tried, he wrote. There were years when he made efforts to be more present, more affectionate, more available. But every time he felt himself getting too close to me, guilt would flood in and he would retreat again. He became convinced that his love for me was somehow selfish, that expressing it fully would diminish his commitment to the Henderson family. What he never realized, what I wish I could have told him while he was still alive, was that love isn't finite. Loving me fully wouldn't have taken anything away from his love for the Henderson children. Honoring his promise to his friend didn't require him to deny his love for his son. But he had created a story in his mind where those two loves were in competition, and he chose what he thought was the more noble path. Jung wrote extensively about this kind of psychological splitting. He understood that when we can't integrate the different parts of ourselves, when we feel forced to choose between competing values or loves, we often end up betraying both. My father thought he was being honorable by holding back his love for me, but in reality, he was dishonoring both his friend's memory and his relationship with his son. His friend hadn't died so that my father could love his children instead of me. His friend had died believing that the people he loved would take care of each other. If he could have seen how his death had created a barrier between my father and me, it would have broken his heart all over again. This revelation shook me to my core, and I can see many of you relating to this in the comments already. Take a moment right now and think about someone in your life you've been judging harshly. Comment below with just their initial and one thing you're willing to try to understand differently about them. Your openness might inspire someone else to do the same. Reading my father's letter taught me something that extends far beyond our relationship. It taught me about the archaeology of human relationships, how we need to dig deeper than surface behaviors to understand the complex motivations that drive people's actions. It taught me that almost every difficult person in our lives is fighting an inner battle we know nothing about. The critical parent might be terrified of their child, failing in a world they see as harsh and unforgiving. The distant spouse might be protecting themselves from vulnerability because they were betrayed in the past. The unavailable friend might be overwhelmed by their own pain and unable to see beyond it to our needs. The difficult co-worker might be acting from a place of insecurity or fear that has nothing to do with us. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. It doesn't mean we should tolerate abuse or neglect our own needs. But it does mean that understanding the deeper story can transform our relationship with the pain those behaviors cause us. When we see someone's actions as symptoms of their inner struggle rather than verdicts on our worth, everything changes. My father's distance wasn't a reflection of my value as a son. It was a reflection of his own internal conflict, his own confusion about how to honor competing loyalties. When I understood that, the hurt I had carried for decades began to transform into something else. Not just forgiveness, but genuine compassion for the impossible position he thought he was in. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward wholeness that requires us to integrate all parts of ourselves, even the parts that seem to contradict each other. My father never completed his individuation. He remained split between duty and love, never finding a way to be both a faithful friend and a present father. But through his letter, he was trying to help me complete my own individuation by understanding that love is complex, that people are complex, and that the stories we tell ourselves about others are often just stories. The letter also revealed something about projection, another key concept in Jung's work. I'd projected onto my father my own fears of being unworthy, unloved, not enough. I had taken his behavior and made it mean something about me instead of understanding it as information about him. How many of our relationship struggles are really about this kind of projection? How many times do we take someone else's actions personally when they're actually revealing something about the other person's inner world? My father projected too. He projected onto me his own guilt and confusion, assuming that I would be better off with a distant father than with a father who was torn between loyalties. He projected his friend's imagined judgment onto every interaction we had, never considering that his friend would have wanted him to love his son fully and freely. When we understand projection, we can begin to separate what belongs to us from what belongs to others. We can stop taking other people's behavior as evidence of our own worth or unworthiness. We can start seeing their actions as information about their inner state rather than verdicts on our value. This understanding doesn't happen overnight. It's a practice, a way of approaching relationships with curiosity instead of judgment. It requires us to ask different questions when someone hurts or disappoints us. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me that they would treat me this way?" we can ask, what might be going on for them that would cause them to act this way? Instead of making assumptions about their motivations, we can wonder about the deeper story we don't know. The next morning, standing at his graveside, I looked around at the faces gathered to say goodbye to my father, and I saw them differently. I saw Mrs. Henderson and her children, now grown with families of their own, weeping as if they had lost their own father. I saw the men from his construction crews, rough hands wiped across tear-stained faces, talking quietly about how he had saved their jobs, their homes, their families during hard times. I saw neighbors who spoke of late-night phone calls when they were in crisis, of help that arrived without being asked for, of a man who showed up when it mattered most. But I also saw something else. I saw the story we tell about someone's life matters just as much as the life itself. The version of my father that everyone else knew was different from the version I had carried in my heart for decades. Their stories of him were full of presence, care, sacrifice, and love. My story of him had been full of absence, distance, and emotional unavailability. Which story was true? They both were. That's what Jung understood about human nature. We are all complex enough to be many different people to many different individuals. The father, who seemed distant to me, was the same man who drove across town at 2 a.m. to fix Mrs. Henderson's broken furnace. The man who couldn't find words to tell me he was proud was the same man who quietly paid for 3 of his employees' children to go to college when their families couldn't afford it. People aren't single stories. We aren't one-dimensional characters who could be summed up in a few personality traits. We are walking contradictions, capable of great love and great fear, often at the same time. We are heroes in some people's stories and disappointments in others, sometimes on the very same day. This realization changed everything about how I approach every relationship in my life now. When someone acts in a way that hurts or confuses me, instead of immediately creating a story about who they are based on that behavior, I try to remember that I'm only seeing one facet of a much more complex human being. I try to get curious about what other stories might be true about them that I haven't discovered yet. My wife used to complain that I was emotionally distant, just like my father. She would get frustrated when I worked late or seemed preoccupied during conversations. Before I found that letter, I would get defensive, denying her accusations while secretly fearing she was right. I was terrified of becoming my father, but I didn't understand what had made him the way he was, so I couldn't figure out how to be different. After reading his letter, I could finally see the pattern clearly. I wasn't distant because I didn't love her. I was distant because I was afraid that if I let her see how much I needed her, how much her opinion mattered to me, how desperately I wanted her approval and affection, I would somehow be weak or needy or too much for her to handle. I had been projecting my own fears onto her, assuming that my love was a burden rather than a gift. Just like my father had projected his guilt about loving me onto his duty to his friend, I was projecting my insecurities about being worthy of love onto my relationship with my wife. When I told her about my father's letter, when I explained the real reason for his distance and how it had affected my own ability to be vulnerable, everything began to change between us. She could finally understand that my emotional walls weren't about her at all. They were about my own fear of being hurt the way I thought my father had hurt me, and I could finally understand that her complaints about my distance weren't attacks on my character. They were expressions of her own need to feel connected to me, to know that she mattered to me as much as I mattered to her. She wasn't trying to make me feel bad about myself. She was trying to get closer to me in the only way she knew how. This is what compassionate understanding does in relationships. It transforms complaints into invitations. It turns accusations into information. It changes defensiveness into curiosity. Instead of hearing, "You're just like your father," as an insult, I could hear it as "I miss you," when you're not present with me. Jung wrote about this process as withdrawing projections. When we project our own fears, needs, or past experiences onto other people, we can't see them clearly. We see them through the filter of our own unresolved issues. But when we take back those projections, when we own our own fears and needs, instead of assuming they're about the other person, we can finally see who they really are. I started practicing this with everyone in my life. When my teenage daughter rolled her eyes at me and muttered something sarcastic under her breath, instead of immediately feeling disrespected and responding with anger, I would pause and wonder, what's really going on for her right now? What need is she trying to express through this behavior that seems designed to push me away? Usually, I discovered that her sarcasm was her way of protecting herself from vulnerability. She would get sarcastic when she was feeling insecure about school, or when she was worried I might be disappointed in her about something, or when she needed reassurance but didn't know how to ask for it directly. When I responded to the need behind the behavior instead of just reacting to the behavior itself, everything changed. Instead of saying, "Don't talk to me that way," I might say, "You seem stressed about something. Want to tell me what's going on?" Instead of getting into a power struggle, I was offering connection. This approach revolutionized my relationship with my mother too. For years after my father's death, she became increasingly critical and controlling. She would call me every day with complaints about her neighbors, her health, the state of the world. She would criticize my parenting, my career choices, my wife's cooking. I found myself dreading her phone calls and limiting my visits because being around her felt so draining. But when I started looking deeper, I realized that all of her criticism and control were really expressions of fear and grief. She had lost her husband, her identity as a wife, her sense of security in the world. Her criticism of others was her way of trying to feel some sense of control when everything in her life felt uncertain. Her complaints were invitations for connection, attempts to feel less alone in her grief. When I started responding to her fear instead of her criticism, our relationship began to heal. When she would complain about the neighbors, instead of getting irritated, I would say, "It sounds like you're feeling pretty alone over there. Would you like me to come visit this weekend?" When she would criticize my parenting, instead of getting defensive, I would say, "Being a grandmother must feel different than you expected. Tell me what you're worried about." The complaints didn't stop immediately, but the energy behind them changed. She began to feel heard and understood instead of dismissed and tolerated. And I began to see her criticism for what it really was: the clumsy attempts of a grieving woman to maintain connection with the people she loved most. This practice of looking deeper, of seeking to understand the need behind the behavior, transforms every relationship it touches. It turns enemies into wounded people who need understanding. It turns difficult people into complex human beings who are doing their best with the tools they have. It turns conflicts into opportunities for deeper connection. But it requires something radical from us. It requires us to give up the story that we are innocent victims of other people's bad behavior. It requires us to take responsibility for our own projections, our own triggers, our own contributions to relationship difficulties. It requires us to choose compassion over righteousness, understanding over judgment, curiosity over certainty. Jung called this radical compassion because it goes against our natural tendency to protect ourselves by making others wrong. It's radical because it assumes that everyone is doing their best with the level of consciousness and emotional resources they currently have. It's radical because it looks for the hurt behind the harm, the fear behind the anger, the need behind the difficult behavior. This doesn't mean we become doormats or tolerate abuse. Compassionate understanding doesn't require us to accept harmful behavior or sacrifice our own well-being for others, but it does mean we respond to difficult people from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. We set boundaries with love instead of anger. We protect ourselves without demonizing others. The day after my father's funeral, I called Mrs. Henderson. I told her about the letter, about finally understanding the promise my father had made to her husband all those years ago. I told her how grateful I was that my father had been able to keep that promise, even though it had cost our family so much. She cried on the phone. She told me she had always wondered if my father resented the time he spent helping her family, if he felt burdened by the promise he had made. She told me there were many times she had tried to release him from that obligation, to tell him he had done enough, but he would always insist that helping them wasn't a burden. It was an honor. What she said next changed everything. She told me that her husband's dying words to my father weren't just about taking care of his family. He had also made my father promise to be a good father to his own son, to love me well, to not let duty to others eclipse his love for his own child. My father had carried both parts of that promise, but somewhere along the way he had convinced himself they were in conflict with each other. He thought he had to choose between loving Mrs. Henderson's children and loving me. He never realized that his friend's deepest wish was for him to do both, to care for the family left behind and to be fully present to his own family as well. This revelation broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. My father had spent decades torn between two parts of the same promise, never realizing that honoring both parts would have been the truest way to honor his friend's memory. He had created an inner conflict that didn't need to exist, and that conflict had robbed all of us, him, me, our entire family, of decades of connection and love. But even in this tragedy there was a gift. His struggle taught me something invaluable about the stories we create and the prisons we build for ourselves with those stories. How many of us are living in conflict with ourselves because we've created false choices, assumed that we have to pick between two things that could actually coexist? How many of us are denying ourselves love, joy, or authentic expression because we've convinced ourselves that being true to one value means betraying another? Jung understood that integration is the key to psychological health. When we can hold multiple truths simultaneously, when we can love fully without guilt, when we can honor our duties without sacrificing our desires, we become whole. But when we split ourselves into competing parts, when we assume that our different loves and loyalties are in conflict, we create unnecessary suffering for ourselves and everyone around us. My father's letter became the beginning of my own integration process. I began to see how I had been splitting myself in similar ways, how I had been convinced that being successful at work meant neglecting my family, how I had assumed that taking care of my own needs was selfish and would hurt the people I loved, how I had created false competitions between different aspects of my life that could actually support and enhance each other. The truth is, we can be devoted parents and successful professionals. We can be loving partners and independent individuals. We can be generous with others and protective of our own well-being. We can honor our past and embrace our future. We can love multiple people fully without diminishing any of those loves. But first, we have to give up the stories that tell us we can't. We have to question the beliefs that create internal conflict and external struggle. We have to be willing to see that the limitations we think are real are often just limitations we've accepted as truth. That night before his funeral, my father gave me the gift of seeing beyond the surface of our relationship to the deeper story underneath. But he also gave me something even more valuable: the understanding that every relationship in my life contains hidden depths, unexplored territories, possibilities for connection and understanding that I haven't discovered yet. The people who frustrate us most might be the people who have the most to teach us about compassion. The relationships that feel most stuck might be the ones with the greatest potential for transformation. The family members who seem most difficult might be the ones who need our understanding most desperately. That night before his funeral changed everything. not just how I saw him, but how I choose to see everyone. The letter didn't just give me back my father, it gave me back my faith in the possibility of understanding, of healing, of finding love in places where I thought only pain existed. Looking back now, I realize that my father's greatest gift to me wasn't the business he built or the financial security he provided. It wasn't even the lessons about hard work and responsibility that he tried to teach through his example. His greatest gift was teaching me through his own struggle that every human being is more complex, more wounded, and more loving than they appear on the surface. The man I thought had rejected me had actually been protecting what he saw as competing loyalties his entire life. The father I thought didn't love me had been carrying the weight of loving too many people and not knowing how to honor all of those loves simultaneously. The relationship I thought was broken beyond repair had actually been intact all along, just hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding and unspoken pain. This revelation transformed not just my understanding of my father, but my entire approach to being human in relationship with other humans. I began to see that every difficult interaction, every moment of feeling unloved or misunderstood, every relationship that seems stuck or broken, contains within it the seeds of deeper connection. If we're willing to look beyond the surface to the fuller story underneath. My marriage transformed when I stopped taking my wife's requests for more emotional intimacy as criticisms of who I was and started hearing them as invitations to become who she needed me to be. My relationship with my daughter deepened when I stopped reacting to her teenage attitude and started responding to the insecurity and need for reassurance that her attitude was trying to protect. My friendship with my brother healed when I stopped being hurt by his tendency to give advice and started appreciating his desire to help me avoid the mistakes he had made. Every relationship in my life became richer when I started asking better questions. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" I started asking, "What are they trying to tell me through this behavior?" Instead of wondering, "What's wrong with them?" I started wondering, what pain might they be carrying that I don't know about? Instead of thinking, how can I get them to change? I started thinking, how can I love them better while still taking care of myself? This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight. It was a practice, a daily choice to see people as complex beings doing their best rather than as sources of frustration or disappointment. Some days I succeeded in this practice. And some days I fell back into old patterns of judgment and reactivity. But each time I chose understanding over assumption, compassion over criticism, curiosity over certainty, the quality of my relationships improved. The practice also changed how I see myself. If I could extend such radical compassion to my father, if I could find ways to understand and forgive his limitations while still honoring my own pain, then perhaps I could extend that same compassion to my own struggles and imperfections. Perhaps the harsh inner critic that had been shaped by years of feeling unloved could be transformed into an inner ally that supported my growth rather than sabotaging my peace. Jung understood that the way we see others is always a reflection of how we see ourselves. When I could see my father as a complex human being trying his best, rather than as a failure or disappointment, I could also see myself as someone worthy of compassion rather than criticism. When I could forgive him for not being the father I needed him to be, I could also forgive myself for not being the son I thought he needed me to be. The healing wasn't just between my father and me. It was within me, between the different parts of myself that had been at war for decades, the part of me that craved love and the part that feared vulnerability, the part that wanted to succeed and the part that was terrified of failure, the part that longed for connection and the part that built walls to protect against rejection. Just like my father had created false competitions between his different loyalties, I had created false competitions between different aspects of myself. I thought I had to choose between being strong and being vulnerable, between being independent and needing others, between protecting myself and opening my heart. But the truth is, we can be both. We can be strong enough to be vulnerable. We can be independent enough to ask for help when we need it. We can protect ourselves while still remaining open to love. This integration of opposites is what Jung called the path to wholeness. It's what my father never quite achieved in his lifetime, but what his letter helped me begin to achieve in mine. It's what I see happening in the lives of everyone who chooses understanding over judgment, compassion over criticism, love over fear. The ripple effects of this transformation continue to spread through every area of my life. At work, I've become a leader who seeks to understand what's behind employee performance issues rather than just addressing the symptoms. In my community, I've become someone who looks for the pain behind difficult behavior rather than just avoiding difficult people. In my family, I've become someone who creates space for everyone's full humanity, rather than demanding that people fit into comfortable categories. Most importantly, I've become someone who tells different stories about the people I love. Stories that make room for their complexity, their struggles, their hidden depths. Stories that assume positive intent even when behavior seems negative. Stories that look for the love that might be hiding behind fear, the care that might be disguised as criticism, the connection that might be masked by defensiveness. The night I found my father's letter, I thought I was just discovering the truth about one man's struggle with competing loyalties. But what I actually discovered was a way of seeing all human beings that transforms every relationship it touches. I discovered that behind every difficult person is a story that would break your heart if you truly knew it. I discovered that most of the time when people hurt us, they're not trying to cause pain. They're trying to avoid it, manage it, or protect themselves from it. I discovered that love is rarely expressed in the ways we expect it to be expressed. My father's love came through providing, protecting and ensuring my independence, rather than through hugs, words of affirmation, and quality time. My mother's love comes through worry and advice, rather than through acceptance and encouragement. My wife's love comes through wanting emotional intimacy, rather than through giving me space. My daughter's love comes through testing my consistency, rather than through easy compliance. When I learned to recognize love in all its forms, even the uncomfortable ones, I found love everywhere I looked. When I learned to see difficult behavior as often being misguided attempts at connection rather than attacks on my worth, I found opportunities for deeper relationship in places where I had only seen conflict before. This doesn't mean I became a doormat or started tolerating harmful behavior. Compassionate understanding doesn't require us to accept abuse or sacrifice our own well-being, but it does mean I learned to set boundaries with love instead of anger, to protect myself without demonizing others, to say no to behaviors while still saying yes to the person behind those behaviors. The most profound change has been in how I think about legacy. My father worried that he hadn't been a good enough father, that he had failed me in ways that couldn't be repaired. But his real legacy wasn't his successes or failures as a parent. His real legacy was the lesson he taught me about the complexity of love, the importance of looking deeper than surface behavior, and the possibility of understanding even when understanding seems impossible. That lesson has made me a better father to my own children. Not because I'm perfect, but because I'm committed to letting them know that they are seen, understood, and loved for exactly who they are. Not because I never make mistakes, but because I'm willing to admit those mistakes and repair any harm they cause. Not because I have all the answers, but because I'm willing to keep asking better questions about how to love them well. It has also made me a better son to my mother, who is still alive and still struggling with grief, loneliness, and the fear that comes with aging. Instead of being frustrated by her complaints and criticism, I look for the love and fear underneath. Instead of avoiding her because her emotions feel overwhelming, I show up with presence and patience. Instead of trying to fix her problems, I listen to her heart. The transformation continues to ripple outward into every relationship I have. With old friends who I had written off as too different from me, with co-workers who I had categorized as difficult or unreasonable, with family members who I had given up on because past hurts felt too big to overcome. In each case, when I've been willing to look deeper, to ask different questions, to assume positive intent even when behavior seemed negative, I've found possibilities for connection that I never would have imagined. Your journey of self-discovery and relationship transformation doesn't end here. It's just beginning. If this story has touched something deep within your soul, I need you to do something powerful right now. Hit that subscribe button because you deserve to continue growing in compassion and understanding. Every week I share stories and insights that will help you see yourself and others with greater clarity and love. Like this video to help other people discover the deeper stories hiding in their own families and relationships. Your like tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters, that stories of healing and understanding deserve to be shared. Share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. You know who I'm talking about. That friend who's struggling with a difficult family member, that colleague who feels unloved or unseen, that family member who has given up on a relationship that once mattered to them. You might be the catalyst for their transformation simply by sharing this story. But most importantly, comment below with your biggest takeaway or commitment to yourself after watching this. Tell me about a relationship in your life that might benefit from you looking deeper beyond the surface behavior to the story underneath. Your willingness to be vulnerable might inspire someone else to take the same brave step toward understanding. Maybe it's time to have that conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it's time to extend forgiveness to someone who hurt you before you understood their full story. Maybe it's time to stop taking someone's difficult behavior personally and start wondering what pain they might be carrying that you don't know about. Remember this: everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Behind every difficult person is a story that would break your heart if you truly knew it. Behind every behavior that frustrates you is a human being trying their best with the tools and understanding they currently have. Choose understanding over assumption. Choose compassion over criticism. Choose to look deeper than the surface, to ask better questions, to tell more generous stories about the people in your life. Choose to believe that healing is possible, that understanding can transform even the most stuck relationships, that love is always present even when it's hidden behind walls of fear or pain. Because sometimes the most beautiful discoveries happen when we're brave enough to see beyond what we thought we knew. Sometimes the key to healing our deepest wounds isn't changing other people. It's understanding them in a way that changes us. The night before his funeral, I learned that my father's greatest struggle became my greatest teacher. His inability to integrate his competing loyalties taught me how to honor all parts of myself and all the people I love. His hidden pain became the source of my deepest compassion. His unspoken love became the foundation for how I choose to love others. You have that same power. The relationships that challenge you most have the most to teach you. The people who trigger you most deeply are often the ones who can help you grow in the most profound ways. The stories that cause you the most pain might be the ones that, when fully understood, set you free. Your legacy isn't just what you accomplish or achieve. Your legacy is how you choose to see the people around you, how you respond when they struggle, how you love them through their imperfections and limitations. Your legacy is the stories you tell about others and the healing you make possible through your willingness to understand. That night in my father's study, holding his letter in my trembling hands, I thought I was just learning about one man's hidden struggle. But what I actually learned was how to be human with other humans. How to love imperfect people perfectly. How to find connection in the midst of conflict and understanding in the heart of confusion. That's the gift I want to leave with you today. Not just the story of my father's secret, but the invitation to look for the secrets, the hidden stories, the deeper truths in every relationship that matters to you. Because when you do, you'll discover that love was there all along, just waiting for you to see it, understand it, and receive it in all its complex and beautiful forms.